Hello there, and welcome once again to Ivythorn Woods. It's the 19th of September, and still it looks just like summer when I look at these trees, and yet it won't last long. Very, very soon it's all going to change. And we're very close to the autumn equinox, which is when we get the equal amount of daytime and night time in this part of the world. So I felt really moved to come out here today just to be with you and share a little bit. So we're on the cusp of a change. We've just had a lunar eclipse, and that also represents another big change in our perceptions. So we're in very exciting times just for a change. Seems that astrologically we always are. And I do find these trees quite spellbinding. So I want to talk about changing perceptions as we're in a time of change. And my simple examples, I used to live in the cities and I loved living in cities. I lived in a few, lived in London, Cardiff, in Wales and Amsterdam, in Holland. And I really enjoyed it, each city. I couldn't help noticing that they were getting smaller. And then there came a time I didn't want to live in the cities anymore. It felt like living in a city to me was kind of a prison. And yet I loved it, loved the city life. And so I made changes, and eventually I ended up living in the countryside. And eventually I ended up living in 225 acres in the river valley in northeast Lancashire, called Middlewood. And that was so many things. It was Arcadia on days like this. And on days when it rained, as it did rain every day for 3 months without a single day without rain, at one point it started to feel like a prison, being imprisoned. And so I ended up moving from there and ended up living on the very edge of a town. And then the next thing I knew, a few years later, I was actually living in the town, really close. And now I live by the sea. Now I'm living in a very large village. But what I detect is that in life I find that what can feel like emerging into freedom, with time it can become another restriction. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about. So for almost a year I've been researching autism by looking at people making YouTube films mostly. It's a real eye-opener. And I guess the first thing that happened is my eyes opened to the fact that I could see myself in the descriptions very, very clearly. And I'm really taken in by this. This is hazel, and hazel can be used to make yurts and geodesic domes and benders. And these poles are just the right thickness and size to be worked with. So what happens is someone cut the original poles off and all these new ones sprout. It's called coppicing. If this tree is coppiced, it lasts for more than 2,000 years. If it's not coppiced, it's dead within 80 years. That's a strange thing. Right, so on we go. So this thing about perceptions, and the more as I studied about autism, the more I identified with the characteristics that were described. And about 6 weeks ago I came across films about ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the more as I researched about this one, the more I realised that the title, ADHD, is completely inappropriate. It doesn't begin to describe the situation at all. And in fact I have played around with some alternative words, but nothing has felt right so far. So then I began to embrace the descriptions there and seeing how it fit me, and see, yeah, I could really feel it, really relate to a lot of what the people were talking about, and with some things and not with others, which is just what you'd expect, I suppose. And so eventually I came to two things. I came to a woman whose first name is Hazel, and she has created an app called Betwixt, and that's a very interesting app indeed. It's only the second app I've ever paid money for. The first was a Pages app on the iPad, which I've used for years, and this is the second one, and it's about going on a journey through the questions that she asks in the app. It's really very revelatory about the nature of reality, which is what I'm coming to. It's what I'm always coming to with anything I end up talking about and thinking about these days. So the next piece of the picture is I came across a woman who was interviewing Dr. Gabor Mate. I know him for his seminal work about what people refer to as addiction, which shamans choose to refer to more as habits. Because if you've got a habit, you've just given us a label, which means it's something that you can pick up and put down. But when you slap a label like addiction onto it, you've just made it into a prison. Another way you can turn things into prisons by the choice of inappropriate wording. Really important. And what Dr. Gabor Mate is saying is he's challenging this condition as a diagnosis, challenging all people's perceptions of it. And one of the things I loved, what really resonated with me, is he started talking about the fact that in the way it's described as ADHD, it's described as being genetic. Now, I'm not certain whether people are doing the same thing with autism, I don't know. But certainly with ADHD, they're putting it down to being genetic, and they're implying it's an inherited condition. And I always smile when I come across such views, because people hold them so forcefully and with such rigidity. And yet way back in 1989, back in the 20th century, Russian scientists proved beyond all doubt that DNA is not a fixed quantity. Inheritance through genetics would work if DNA was fixed, but it isn't. It's very, very susceptible to all sorts of influences, most especially the amount of water we drink, the thoughts that we hold, and the way we choose to frame our reality. So in fact, genetics, as a descriptor or an explanation for any illness, is fundamentally flawed. Which, when you think about it, that's another way of turning something from a prison to being a liberation or freedom. Because if genetics and DNA is fixed, then people are imprisoned by their conditions or illnesses. But when we realise that DNA can be changed by simply how many glasses of water we've drunk that day, well, that just shows the nonsense for what it is. So DNA is highly reactive, highly susceptible, highly dependent upon what we choose to do with ourselves, what we choose to take in, and even the thoughts and the beliefs and the opinions we have about things. So here I'm coming up to my point now. My point is, when I first came across the label of ME and the diagnosis, it was a liberation, because it explained so many things that I didn't understand about what was going on with me. And as I became more attached to that label, it eventually became a prison. So having done my researches with autism, I could see exactly the same pattern unfolding again. It starts off as, what a liberation, now I understand myself. All these peculiar traits I've got, it all starts to make sense. And if I identify with it all too much and I become too attached to it all, it then becomes another kind of a prison. And then the same thing with the ADHD. So Dr. Gabor Mate is challenging people's opinions of things like addictions, labels and diagnoses, and is inviting us to be much more flexible in our approach and our attitude to, you've guessed it, the nature of reality. That's what it all comes down to. So it's so helpful to remember to be open, playful, adventurous, and willing to experiment. And there's something that I've found incredibly helpful for a lot of my life ever since I came across it. It's called chaos magic. So chaos magic has only one axiom, and the axiom is nothing is true, everything is permitted. They say that is the nature of reality. Nothing is true, everything is permitted. So with that being the case, if you take that axiom to be the case, as chaos magicians do, what it means to say is it means to say you can suspend your disbelief in anything, and you can choose to take on the belief system in a playful way, just exploring how it feels. And that's what I've been doing with autism and with ADHD. And I've really gone into identifying with these labels and taking on how it feels, and then discovering how it can take us from a sense of freedom back to a sense of being imprisoned or controlled. And so how wonderful it is to realise, most particularly with the power of the word, with our ability to shape our reality using words, that I could suspend my disbelief and I can embrace the idea of autism and ADHD as being relevant, and then when I've had enough I can just put them down. And what I notice about some of the people who are making these films about these diagnoses, these labels, is that some of them, not all, but some of them become so incredibly attached to the labels that I imagine that they would find this, what I'm saying, is very inflammatory and extremely offensive. And I can only apologise if that's the way some people might choose to take it. But what I'm suggesting is that life is so much more wonderful, miraculous and amazing than we tend to think. And that includes us. We are most definitely, emphatically, so much more wonderful, amazing and marvellous than we tend to accept or give credence for. And there are times, and I'm sure you've had these experiences, when there's something that's happened and you've had to just step up and do something and you didn't know whether you'd be able to do it, and then you did it and you discovered, yeah, I can do that, that's wonderful, hey, I'm so much more flexible, so much more open, so much more powerful than I realised, and I've just proved it. Look, I just did that, whatever that may happen to be. So the tenet of chaos magic is you suspend your disbelief, embrace something for as long as it suits you, explore it, see how it fits, and then as soon as you feel like you're done, just let it go and go back to zero again, back to 0 point. And that's something else I've made films about before, but it's another belief system to play with in an entire human life. If we've got units, then if you've got a gazillion units of negativity in your life, then you'll have a gazillion units of positive in your life. If you look at the entire life, or if that's too much for you to cope with, then all of your lifetimes. So maybe sometimes a person goes through a lifetime where it's really, whoa, it's just veil of tears, veil of tears, veil of tears. And then another life comes along and it's just, wow, absolutely amazing, such incredible experiences, such joy, such bliss, such love. So that's another thing you can do. You can look at, well, having a particularly challenging time at the moment. That's great, it's wonderful. Give yourself the opportunity to realise that, in a way it's like money in the bank, all those negative experiences. And there'll come a time when, like everything does, it changes, And suddenly you'll go from I've got no money to I've got plenty of money, or I've got no relationship to I've got an amazing relationship, or I've got no health and suddenly I'm radiantly healthy. And this sort of thing does happen. There are so many people that have written books about this. I remember a guy had tuberculosis when he was age 2 called Georges Arwa, about to die as far as he was concerned. Somehow he managed to keep going, and years later he became an advocate for health and created a completely new system called macrobiotics. So you never know what you're capable of doing. So all the love to you, and play and play some more is my suggestion. Very interested to hear what is happening for you at the moment. Thank you very much.